Hello, my name is Neil Anderson. I'm a professor of linguistics and English language at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. It's my pleasure this morning to visit with you about the importance of reading, and in particular in looking at similarities and differences between first language reading and second language reading. I've had the opportunity of working with reading teachers in many parts of the world in addressing the particular needs that second language readers have in accomplishing the purpose of comprehending what they are reading and making sense out of text. I believe that if we want strong readers emerging from our classrooms, that we need teachers who are well prepared to address the issues that face second language readers. We're all aware of the many challenges that face the nation and the world in terms of developing language abilities, and in particular in developing the ability to read. We know that there are about 6 million American students who face challenges because they read at below their level of ability. So there are many things that we as educators need to do in order to help these students become better readers. I'm a teacher that firmly believes that if you want good users of a language, you want to centralize your curriculum on reading and help students to become good readers. And as they become good readers, they are then in a position to better use their skills and their knowledge in listening and speaking and grammar and writing, because they're anchored solidly in having understood what they have read. Among the 6 million American students that are reading below their grade level, we know that the challenge is even greater for the students that many of us work with who are reading and speaking English as their second language. We know that from some of the data that's available that about 89% of students who speak English as a second language at the 8th grade level are reading below their grade level. So what is it about reading that we as language educators and as teachers should be focusing on in order to help students be better comprehenders? In the presentation today, I would like to focus primarily on similarities and differences between first and second language reading, so that as language teachers or as educators in the school system, we have a clear understanding of how these two reading processes are similar and how these two processes are different. And you'll be surprised, I think, to recognize that there are more differences between first and second language reading than there are similarities. In order for us to adequately address these similarities and differences between first and second language reading, let me first set the stage. I want to do that by first defining reading so that we're clear at least on how I'm looking at the act of reading. I want to focus on some key factors that we should keep in mind as teachers when we're working with learners in our classrooms. Third, I'd like to look at the issue of learning to read and reading to learn. Fourth, we'll consider ability and proficiency issues that are important as we look at first and second language reading. With that as a foundation, we'll then focus on 4 similarities between first and second language reading and 10 differences between these two important processes. So let's begin by looking at a definition of reading. As you can see from the slide, I define reading as being comprised of 4 key elements. Those elements include the reader, the text, strategies, and fluency. Let's look at each of these for just a moment. The reader plays a very important part in our definition of reading. The reason that the reader plays an important part of the definition is because each reader has a different set of knowledge and skills within them that helps to contribute to comprehension, which is the goal of reading. Readers have background knowledge and experience from books that they've read, from newspaper articles that they've seen, from things that they've seen on television, from video games that they have played, from interactions that they've had with other people. All of those experiences influence the way that we approach the act of reading. So we can't talk about the act of reading without really understanding who the reader is and what kinds of experiences they have had to help them at this particular moment in time to make sense of the text that they are reading. The text is an important part in defining reading. There are expository texts which give students new information. Textbooks are expository kinds of texts. There are narrative texts, stories. Many of the readers that we work with will have had experience in their individual lives of reading many stories or having stories read to them. It's important for us to know when we define reading that there is a difference in texts as to whether they are expository or narrative in nature. And we want to make sure that as we're looking at the act of reading, that we understand that the text is going to ultimately influence the outcome that the learners have in comprehending and working with the text. We can't look at just the reader and the text in defining reading. We also have to be aware that there are many strategies that readers will use in order to access the material that they have at their disposal. It's important that we understand that there are no good and bad strategies for reading. What may work perfectly well for me as a reader may not work so well for you. So rather than approaching the issue of strategies as good or bad, more effective, less effective, I think what we want to do is expose readers to a wide variety of strategies that can help them accomplish their purpose in comprehending text. What we do know is that good comprehenders use a wide range of strategies, and poorer comprehenders have a more narrow, restricted range of strategies. The reason that I think strategies are an important part of our definition of reading, particularly for us as educators, is that we want to make sure that we're providing multiple opportunities for students to become familiar with the wide range of strategies that are available to them. If we can help the struggling reader to become familiar with more strategies, we can help them in the process of developing and improving their reading. A final element in our definition of reading is the issue of fluency. Fluency is receiving increased visibility in education, not just here in the United States, but throughout the world. I have defined fluency as reading at an appropriate rate with adequate comprehension. And perhaps the first question that comes to your mind is, well then what's an adequate rate and what's adequate comprehension? Our reading rates will vary depending on the kind of text that we're reading. We will read narrative texts typically at a faster rate than we will an expository text. In an expository text with which we're familiar with the content, we will read that passage at a faster rate than we will read an expository text that has new information that is more difficult, or an expository text that contains vocabulary words that are a little bit beyond our proficiency level. So our rate will vary depending on the kind of text that we're reading. We also want to look at the comprehension. We cannot talk about fluency as being just rate. I think that that's a mistake that many educators make, that when they look at issues related to fluency, they're only thinking about rate. But I think that an important component of fluency is the comprehension. I like to remind my students that they don't have to understand 100% of what they're reading. Many of the students that I work with assume that if they're going to be good comprehenders, they have to understand 100%. I think that that's a false assumption for learners. I tell them that if we can get you to understand 70% of what you're reading, and you're reading at an appropriate rate, that you'll be able to then use what you're understanding at the rate at which you're understanding it to move through the massive amounts of texts that students are going to have to read, particularly at the middle school, high school, and university levels. There's so much text that students have to read that if they're reading slowly and reading word by word, they're not going to be able to get through all of the material that they're going to have to read. So you see these four key parts of the definition of reading: the reader, the text, strategies, and fluency, I think are key elements that we want to keep in mind as we talk today about similarities and differences between readers who are reading in their first language and readers who are reading in their second language. Let's move now and talk about some key factors that we as educators should keep in mind when we're working with learners. It is important that we know who our learners are, that we're aware of what kinds of experiences they've had and what types of exposure they have had to literacy and to print material, so that we can then help them become better readers. I think it's important that we know, in particular for first language readers, what type of literacy experiences they have had prior to arriving to our classrooms. We can't assume that all first language readers are having the same rich print exposure experiences. We know that many of these readers come from backgrounds where they have limited exposure to print. So I think that it's very important that we have a grounding on what types of experiences our learners have had with literacy before coming to our classrooms. For our second language readers, gathering this information is even more important. I think that it's vital that we have a concept of how literate a learner is in their first language. If we're working with an adolescent, we want to know if they can read at grade level in their first language. There's a huge difference in the way that we can approach reading instruction when we're working with learners that are fully literate and reading at grade level. So gathering this information about prior reading experience and exposure is very important for us. For second language learners, I think that it's very important that we have a sense of how their oral fluency is, what level they're at with their oral fluency. I work with many second language readers whose oral proficiency is much higher than their reading ability. And they're often disappointed that I haven't placed them into a class for reading that matches their level of oral proficiency. But I try to help them understand that their higher level of oral proficiency is a great asset and will help them as they're trying to develop their second language reading skills. But the way that I deal with that learner will be very different from the way that I deal with a learner who has low-level oral proficiency. So I think that it's vital that we have a grounding in where our learners are at in terms of their oral proficiency. Third, I think that it's vital for us to have an understanding and knowledge of what the age of arrival was in the United States for our second language reader. Did the student that we're working with recently immigrate to the United States? Or have they been in the United States for many years? Perhaps they were born here, but have grown up in a home where the first language was the primary language of use at home. All of these key factors will provide us with information that will help us make important decisions about how we can approach the instruction of this particular type of learner. I think it's also very important for us to understand what the expectations are of the students of their school learning experience. Do they have an expectation that they're going to continue building their language skills? Do they have an expectation that they will be able to go home each day and talk with their family members about things that they have learned while they've been in school? What is it that the learner expects school to help them to do to serve then as the stepping stone for accomplishing the goals that they have individually set? There are different types of second language readers, and I think that this fifth factor for us to keep in mind is to understand what type of reader that we're working with. Motivation plays a key role in our understanding of text and our understanding of printed material. Are we working with a reader who is highly motivated, one who is internally driven to reach high levels of comprehension? Or are we working with the type of learner that needs to be motivated? I think that there are many things that we as language teachers can do in the reading classroom in order to help provide a stimulating, motivating atmosphere. I can tell you that over the years I have not always believed that it was my role as a language teacher to provide that a very strong, motivating classroom atmosphere. I think early in my career I believed that it was primarily the learner's responsibility, that if I wanted good comprehenders, it needed to be the learner who wanted to comprehend. But I've changed that aspect of my philosophy over the years because I recognize that there are very important things that I can do as a language teacher to create and stimulate motivation within the learner, to help them want to read, to help them want to become more actively engaged in print. So knowing the type of motivation that our students have is a very important factor to keep in mind. Finally, I think that it's very important that we know what the parents' literacy level and educational background is, particularly for our students that we're working with in the primary and secondary school settings. We want to get some information that will help us know whether the students are living in an environment where literacy is encouraged. I think that there are many things that we can do as teachers to help encourage parents to be more actively engaged in the reading that their children will be doing at home and in school. So if we have some knowledge about the parents' expectation for the development of literacy skills and what the parents' literacy skills are, we'll be in a stronger position as teachers to help our students become better readers. These are the 6 key factors that I think we as teachers should keep in mind as we're working with students in the development of their reading skills. With all aspects of second language reading, and first, I think that it's important for us to keep in mind whether we're focusing on learning to read or reading to learn. In order for me to better understand this particular often viewed as a dichotomy, I have created a continuum, the reading and learning continuum. You'll see on the screen now a visual that I've created that helps me to better understand this issue. On the left side, you'll see that we've got learning to read, and on the right-hand end of the continuum is reading to learn. I think in many cases we assume that if the child is in kindergarten through third grade, that that's the time when they will learn to read. And then once they move into about fourth grade and beyond, that they're reading to learn. I think for first language readers and for learners in our school system, that's a fairly safe assumption. But I think that when we begin looking at the issues that are facing second language readers, we can no longer assume that reading has been fully developed in those early years of elementary school. So you'll see on the bottom half of the graphic that I've divided it into 3 segments of language proficiency: beginning, intermediate, and advanced. Regardless of the age of the learner that we're working with, if we're working with the learner at beginning levels of language proficiency, I think that it's safe for us to assume that that learner is still in the early stages of developing literacy skills. And what we want to do is make sure that we're providing opportunities for those learners to learn how to read. So for the middle school, high school, or university level reader that's engaging in text in their second language, if they're at the beginning levels of language proficiency, our role may be more of the role of a reading teacher in trying to help these students learn how to read. But from about the intermediate level of language proficiency and beyond, we can help merge those students from learning to read to reading to learn. And I think that this is a very exciting time in the language acquisition process for us to be engaged with the learners and helping them to see all of the things that they can now have access to as they are learning how to gain new knowledge from what they're reading. So I think that it's important for teachers to keep that continuum in mind and to have an idea of where the learners are at. If I'm working with learners that are in the fourth grade or beyond, I often like to show them this continuum and have them do a self-assessment and tell me, on this continuum of learning to read to reading to learn, where do you fall? Where do you think you are as a reader? And I use that information along with my assessment of their ability to see if we're synchronized in terms of our evaluation of where the individual is at. And I like to ask that question multiple times during the time that I'm engaged with that student, so that I can see if they see themselves making progress in moving towards the reading to learn end of the continuum, so that they're accessing printed material and using printed material in ways that will help them gain the kinds of knowledge that they desire to gain. The next thing that I think is important for us to consider is the ability level of the reader and the proficiency level of the reader. Particularly for second language readers, this is a very important thing for us to be looking at. You'll see on the slide a graphic that comprises 3 key elements of research that we know about first and second language reading. You'll see that the main line looks at second language reading ability. I think that it's important that this is our focal point because it is the second language reading skills that we're trying to develop. And we want the learner to have strong second language reading ability so that they can accomplish the academic tasks that are before them. But we know from many years of research in second language reading that there are two key additional aspects that influence second language reading ability. The first of those is second language proficiency. And you'll see on the continuum the point of departure and then the arrows merging out from there for second language proficiency. Notice that as the arrows move towards the high end of second language proficiency, that the distance between the arrows widens. That's because there is a greater influence of second language proficiency and second language reading as students become better at both. If we want good second language readers, we've also got to be looking at opportunities for developing their language proficiency. The second piece that strongly influences second language reading ability is first language reading ability. And you'll see from the point of departure there that we've got a similar pattern happening with the arrows merging out from second language reading. We know that the higher one's first language reading ability is, that the greater that transfer will be in their second language reading. But also notice how second language proficiency can account for more of the difference in one's second language reading ability than their first language reading ability. So the position of the lines and the arrows on the line here is important for us to be able to keep in mind visually, because we can see that if we're working with second language readers, we've got to be focusing on their language proficiency more than the strength of their first language reading skills. But that doesn't mean that we want to ignore their first language reading skills. We want to be able to use that knowledge and the information about their first language reading, and the stronger their first language reading skills are, the better second language reader they'll be. Now, I think that this has very strong implications, particularly for the lower grades of elementary school. I think that if we want to develop very strong if we want to develop very strong second language readers, we want to also make sure that those second language readers have strong literacy skills in their first language. So if I were working with elementary school students, particularly at the learning to read end of the continuum, I would want to be helping those students learn and develop literacy skills in their first language, as well as introducing them to literacy skills in their second language. And then we're able to use that information and the skills that they're developing in their first language to help them transfer some of those skills to their second language reading. This reminds me of one additional point that I think is important for us to keep in mind. We only learn how to read once in our life. Once you've learned how to read, it's then just a matter of taking what you know about reading and expanding and building on that process as you read in your second language. Now, there are challenges that you will have when you face the second language reading process, but it's not like you're learning how to read again. Getting the information about directionality of text and that words have meaning, and being able to understand issues of transition words and how paragraphs are organized and how full texts are organized. Once you've got a firm understanding of that in your first language, you don't have to learn that information again. You're transferring that information to the second language reading context. So with this visual that you see there on the screen, you see that we've got reading ability, second language reading ability, second language proficiency, and first language reading ability. It's very clear from the literature that these three elements have interrelationships and influence each other in positive ways. There are two additional key factors that I think are important for us to keep in mind when we're looking at the interrelationships of second language reading ability, second language proficiency, and first language reading ability. And those factors are the text type as well as the reading task. I think as a profession we're still quite weak in the research that we've produced in looking at the interrelationships among these three variables in terms of the tasks that we ask the students to do and the text that they're doing it with. So there's much more that we can learn about how to improve second language reading, particularly when we're looking at how reading changes when we change the task and when we change the text type. That's going to have an impact, I think, on the relationship of first language reading ability and second language proficiency. So I think that one of the things that we can be doing as educators is more carefully considering how the relationship or how the second language reading changes when we're looking at these different tasks that we engage learners in and the different types of texts. And the texts ties back into the comment earlier about the different texts of expository and narrative. Again, it's very important for us to keep in mind that those two text types are quite different from each other, and there will be different outcomes in terms of what we should be expecting of readers on whether they're engaged in expository or narrative texts. Using this now as the firm foundation, let's identify 4 similarities between first and second language reading and talk about these similarities and how, as teachers, we can use the advantage of these similarities to help strengthen second language readers. The first of these is that reading involves the reader, the text, and the context in which reading takes place. So just as we were defining reading as comprising the important element of the reader and the text, this is where similarities between first and second language reading overlap. We want to make sure that we're considering the reader and the text and the context in which the reading act is taking place. And we can do that whether they're reading in their first or their second language. And we can use information about what's happening with the reader and the text and the context in helping us to know how to best strengthen the reading context that we're engaged in. A second similarity is to involve the use of metacognitive strategies. I think that it's very important that we help learners become more aware of how they learn, that we help these learners become more aware of what happens when they read. This is important in both first and second language reading, and we can have similar kinds of discussions with learners about metacognition, whether they're reading in their first or their second language. So if I'm working in a diverse classroom where I've got some first language readers and some second language readers, one of the things that I can do that will strengthen both readers is to help them engage in metacognitive strategy understanding, helping them step back from their reading and talk about how they are comprehending what they're reading. I think that this is particularly important because if you're a poor comprehender, whether you're reading in your first language or your second language, if you can have discussions with learners that are good comprehenders and listen to a good comprehender talk about what he or she is doing while they're reading, that can help you as the poorer comprehender gain access to strategies and things that you can do to improve your comprehension. Even good comprehenders can understand poorly at particular points in time. And as I listen to other good comprehenders talk about what they do when they read, it gives me ideas of things that I can do when I face challenges in the reading process. A third similarity between first and second language reading is to involve the orchestration of both bottom-up and top-down strategies. In first language reading, we know that it is the interaction of both bottom-up and top-down strategies that make good readers. The same is true for second language readers. They need to be engaged in accessing and using both bottom-up and top-down strategies. But it's very clear from the research, particularly some that David Eske did years ago, that we as second language educators are not very good at teaching second language readers the bottom-up skills that they need to be successful readers. We're quite good at implementing top-down activities, but we're not very good at the bottom-up for second language readers. So again, if I'm working in a classroom that has both first and second language readers, I can help those readers by engaging them in both bottom-up and top-down instructional activities that help them to integrate the two to become better readers. A fourth similarity between first and second language readers is that the readers involve the use of language systems with systematic and rule-governed phonological, morphological, syntactical, semantic, and discourse structures. So here we want to involve all aspects of the language and helping the learner to access all aspects of the language in order to make better comprehension moves as a reader. If the reader understands the grammar of the language and how the grammar is working, that's going to help them be a better comprehender. Helping the students to have access to semantics and understanding that an individual word might have multiple meanings depending on the context in which it occurs is a very important thing for us to be helping readers understand. And we can do that when we're working with both first and second language readers. Let's now highlight 10 differences between first and second language reading. The first difference is language systems. Here it's very important for us to have a knowledge of the type of language background that our second language reader comes from. Are they coming from an alphabetic language? Is there a directionality issue in the way that the text is laid out? What are phonological and morphological issues that are challenging for our second language readers? We know that based on the language background of the student, that's going to have a great impact on their acquisition of the print and their ability to access and gain meaning from what they're reading. So be aware of what language system your learners are coming from, and keep in mind how literacy in that language is used in order to help people gain comprehension or meaning from what they're reading. Second, there will be a size of vocabulary knowledge difference between our first language readers and our second language readers. And so it's very important for us to know about the vocabulary size of the reader. That's why it's important for us to know what level of language proficiency the second language reader is at. We know in studies related to vocabulary that the acquisition of academic vocabulary is much more challenging than the acquisition of common vocabulary that we use in our oral discourse. So we want to be looking at how we can incorporate and help build students' vocabulary. We also want to know whether the student has access to the meaning of the word that they're learning how to read. For first language readers, the majority of them are learning to read words that they already have a firm comprehension of. They're not encountering new words. They're just learning how the words get encoded in print. For our second language readers, it's not safe to assume that they're going to understand all of the words, because those words in print may not be part of their oral vocabulary. So looking at all of the many issues related to vocabulary and vocabulary size are going to be a very big difference between a first and a second language reader. A third point to keep in mind is related to the language awareness among first and second language readers. In many cases, an adolescent or adult second language reader is going to be much more aware of the language than a first language reader. Second language readers typically have a more firm grounding in language elements that the native speaker and native reader of English has learned through the process of being exposed to the language. Knowledge about the language and that language awareness is going to be an advantage for the second language reader, and one that we can tap into as an educator. Fourth, it's very important for us to keep in mind the amount of time that it will take to developing reading skills, particularly when we're working with adolescents who are moving into the to the reading to learn end of the continuum. Academic material is very different than narrative kind of material that students will be engaged in when they read. So part of what we want to be keeping in mind is that it's going to take a longer period of time for students to develop the academic language and the time to develop the reading skills in using that academic reading than it would for a native speaker. Fifth is the issue related to reading fluency. We know that second language readers typically read slower than first language readers. And that's a difference between the two types of reading. So I think that it's very important for us as reading teachers or as content teachers working with second language readers to understand that the fluency issues that second language readers encounter are going to produce or be a greater demand for them. So they're going to be reading slower. It's going to take them longer to engage with the text than it will for our first language reading students. A sixth difference that we need to look at between first and second language readers is the issue of motivation. We've talked a little about it already today, but I think that sometimes our second language readers need more facilitation from the teacher in order to help them maintain levels of motivation. And I think that there are very simple things that we can do as language teachers and as content teachers in helping students to be motivated. If second language readers understand why they're engaging with the text that they're working with, it can often help them to be motivated to get engaged with the text. So as a teacher in the classroom, I always want to make sure that students understand why we're reading something and what it is we're going to do with what we've read, so that they can have the motivation to accomplish the ultimate task because they've read and understood well what they were reading. Number 7 is the issue of oral English proficiency. And we've also spoken about that already today in looking at the issue of when you've got a strong oral foundation in your language skills, that is going to help you in getting access to vocabulary words when you're learning to put what you know in your oral language into use in reading. That's why I think that it's very important for us to be looking at that issue of second language proficiency. Oral proficiency is going to be a key aspect for us to be looking at in second language learners. And that's going to create a difference in how we work with those second language readers when we're engaged with them and trying to learn new content in the classes that we're delivering. Number 8 is the issue of background knowledge. I think that it's very important for us to understand that good readers always draw on their background knowledge when they are reading. And background knowledge can fill in gaps in what may be missing explicitly from text. When we're working with second language readers, I think there are 2 important things for us to keep in mind in terms of background knowledge. One is we cannot always assume that the student has the background knowledge. For example, with second language learners that I have been working with, we're doing a content-based approach for language instruction with them and using American history as the content. We've selected this content because it's going to be one of the requirements for these learners as they merge into the U.S. education system to be able to read and understand about American history. Many of these readers lack what we would assume is common knowledge, common background knowledge about American history and key events that children from very, very young in first language reading contexts grow up understanding and knowing about. So what I've learned is that in some cases the students that we're working with in second language contexts may not have the background knowledge to fill in the missing pieces that may be in a text. And so we may have to provide them with that knowledge. And second, many second language readers don't know how to explicitly draw on their background knowledge to make explicit connections between what they're reading and what they already know. So I think that there are very simple things that content and classroom teachers can use in order to help students understand that something they're reading about is something that they already know about, and making the explicit connections with their background knowledge can facilitate comprehension and increase what the learners walk away understanding from the text. Ninth is the context in which literacy is developed. I think that this is a very important aspect for us to keep in mind, because we want to make sure that the learners that we're very much aware of the context that the learners are developing their literacy skills. We've talked about some of those issues already today that are a great challenge for second language readers. Some of those factors will be the literacy elements and exposure that they have at home. What type of reading exposure they have in their first language. How much reading do they do in their second language? I think it's also important for us to keep in mind contextually, what's the ultimate goal of the student that we're working with? What do they want to be able to accomplish in their second language? And what kinds of texts and contexts are they going to have to operate in order to achieve their individual goals? The final difference that I would like to point out is for us to always keep in mind what is the position of the learner on the path to literacy. Understanding where the student is at on the path to literacy is a very important difference between first and second language reading. In being able to identify where they're at on that path, do they have strong first language literacy skills? Or are they weak in their first language reading? Where are they at in the development of their second language literacy skills? And having a clear picture in our mind of where the learner is at on that pathway to literacy will be very different for the second language reader than for the first language reader. In what we've covered today, we've talked about a definition of reading. We've looked at some key aspects that we should keep in mind as we're working with readers. We've talked about the learning to read and reading to learn continuum. And we've identified similarities and differences between first and second language reading. These differences are grounded in very solid research that helps us understand the interrelationships among second language reading ability, second language proficiency, and first language reading ability. I hope that what we've addressed today are things that will help you better understand how to help students become better readers. I think as language educators, as we make better progress in understanding the relationships among language issues and proficiency issues, that we'll be better prepared to help our students be successful in the classrooms in which we are engaged. Thank you.